Welcome, welcome, welcome. I was just remarking to Claire, I think one of the things that struck me is just how much hugging there's been. I love it. I love it. Like, clearly we should see each other more often in other venues as well, because you have a lot to talk about. So thank you all for attending what is sure to be a memorable and heartfelt event honoring a larger than life scholar, mentor, and leader, Dr. Nancy Adler. My name is Eric Prather, and I'm honored to currently serve as the director of the center that Nancy founded 2 decades ago, the Center for Health and Community. This event is something that is going to happen in perpetuity, and we're very excited to do this on an annual basis, and I hope that all of you will come and join us. And we're really grateful to all the folks that have played an important role in supporting the CHC for all these years, including for this event. Especially Lisa Stone-Pritzker, who's here. And then I really want to formally thank our CHC staff, Dina Friege, Jennifer Taggart, Lucy Coe, and Cherie Rivera, along with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences staff, in working tirelessly to get this event off the ground, including the beautiful lunch reception that we're going to have on the terrace. The weather looks like it's going to be great. So I hope that you all will join us after that, after this. So with no further ado, I want to get this started and welcome up Dr. Matt State, the Oberndorf Family Distinguished Professor and Chair of our Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, for a few remarks.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you here. I'm going to keep my remarks short. We have a wonderful program for you today, and time is tight. So I just wanted to tell you how grateful we are that you are here today to help us celebrate the life of Dr. Nancy Adler through this lectureship, which, as you heard now, will continue on in perpetuity, which is just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. As Eric said, I'm Matt State. I'm chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here, and I want to welcome you to our building, the Nancy Pritzker Psychiatry Building, for this second annual Dr. Nancy Adler Lecture. This is here and now as established in perpetuity to honor Nancy's memory, her extraordinary contributions to the field as a mentor and a researcher, an academic leader, a national leader in organized science and medicine. I think it's very safe to say that no single individual had or continues to have as much of an impact on advancing the notion that contemporary medicine has to address the behavioral, environmental, social, and cultural aspects of health and healthcare delivery. Her legacy clearly lives on in all the wonderful hugs we saw this morning and the generations of trainees that she's inspired that are here with us today, both in the room and on Zoom. I think it has been remarkable to see her impact through the continued work of the Center for Health and Community, and on what I believe is truly an increasing priority that academic institutions and healthcare systems and national policymakers are placing now on addressing the social determinants of health. I'm delighted again that all of you could join us today for remembrances for our wonderful keynote lecture and for what I'm sure will be a very stimulating panel discussion. It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Claire Brindis, who is a close friend and colleague of Nancy's. She is the Distinguished Emerita Professor of Pediatrics and Health Policy, wonderfully on recall in the departments of pediatrics and obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive health sciences. She's the Emerita Director of the Philip R. Lee Institute for Health Policy Studies, co-director of the Adolescent and Young Adult Young Adult Health National Research Center, and a host of other roles and contributions that she makes both at the level of the university and also through her work at the National Academy of Medicine. Her research focuses on program evaluation and translation of research into policy at the local, state, and national levels, and it is fitting to have her lead off for us today as she has pursued a lifelong commitment to ameliorating the impact of social, health, and economic disparities among ethnic and racial populations, with a particular focus on women, young adults, and adolescents and reproductive health. Claire, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Matt, for a lovely introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here with all of you to celebrate this very important event, the perpetuity of this special recognition of my dear friend, Nancy Adler. And I speak not only for myself, but I speak for so many of you. I want to particularly note conversations with Alyssa Epple and Laura Godley and Eric and Dina, as well as Lisa Stone-Pritzker, who has given so much of herself to us in this beautiful building. And I know many, many others I could name. So as I was thinking about this conversation with you all, the image that came to my mind was this very complex maze that reflected Nancy's distinguished career and the journey that she built throughout her lifetime, developing the evidence that is the scaffolding for so many of our careers. So just for a moment, I'd like you to close your eyes and go back to the early 70s. I know some of you were not even born, but I want you to go back because I want you to think about the fact that the concepts that we're very familiar with today were so new at the time that Nancy was so involved in helping to launch them, whether it was research on social factors such as discrimination and how that gets under our skin, or that health is not merely a matter of individual choice and genetics, or the fact that we need to have prepare the future of researchers to really take on this very important agenda. So you can open your eyes. And I want to acknowledge that while some of these concepts were in the air and the gases of the 70s and 80s and beyond, it was really important to have Nancy as the spark of energy, as a catalyst for change. And this change continues to be part of that legacy that will be with us for the rest of our days. And so when I see the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services embracing bringing the funding for mental health services, as well as housing and food, as well as the US Department of Health and Human Services, acknowledging the role of social determinants of health as a key initiative of not only the Healthy People 2030, but also the 2020 campaign. I could go on with the legacy components of Nancy's career, but just this is sort of part of what we are celebrating today. So I have 4 themes that I will be sharing in the next few minutes, and I will build upon her contributions through those 4 themes. So this is symbolic of of Nancy being a boundless explorer of uncharted territory. She was always at the cutting edge, and as we know, people at the cutting edge sometimes get bloodied, but Nancy was extremely courageous. And whether she was conducting research on the impact of abortion on women's mental health, which continues to be incredibly important in this post-Dobbs era, or how in the late 70s, she and Dr. George Stone and Francis Cone termed health psychology, representing a sea change in our understanding of disease etiology and treatment, or whether her beginnings of the first graduate and postdoctoral program in health psychology, which was not a model that only occurred here at UCSF, but it was a model that then began to be replicated globally. And we're going to be hearing from some of her stellar students who went through that program. Theme 2 is about Nancy as a relentless visionary. And here again, she conducted the pioneering work on income inequality, stress, initially with cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but also really challenging the notion of health solely as a matter of individual choice and genetics. She was a leader in explaining the psychosocial pathways that really get under the skin, as I've said before, and that establishing the value and importance of socioeconomic status is really a constant predictor of morbidity and mortality. Her leadership as in the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on socioeconomic status and health for 15 years was again instrumental in changing a whole field of scholarship. She led a transdisciplinary team of eminent scientists from across the globe in helping to map how lower income and educational attainment really impact the cellular function. So through these experiences and through many others, Nancy recognized the importance of embracing a multidisciplinary approach, strengthening and marshaling multiple disciplines to solve some of the most complex social and human problems. She was devoted to bridging the gap between biomedical and social sciences with the mission of achieving greater health equity. And this leads me to her third theme of being a strategic social system engineer. And when I say this, I'm talking about how she, from the MacArthur work, that led to the development of the ladder and scale of subjective social status, which has been a widely used tool that has been cited in over 400 articles in the literature. She established how important that subjective self-rating is key because it's so closely tied to physiological health and stress reactivity. But she was relentless in the fact that it wasn't enough just to have wonderful research reports. What she really recognized was the importance of training the next cadre of leaders in the field. And so with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholars Program, that led to many more interventions and works of scientific rigor. And not only did she focus on academic sites, but she really focused on transforming the public's understanding of the relationship between socioeconomic status, self-perceived status in society, and physical health outcome. And this also led to her being a leader here at UCSF in introducing the first social and behavioral sciences curriculum in our School of Medicine. And like many things at UCSF, where we are a learning laboratory, what happens at UCSF doesn't stay at UCSF. And so what we see here is the influence of this type of curriculum as it affects and shapes medical students, nursing students, dental and pharmacy students throughout the world. So I think that this is a very important aspect of her work in being a social engineer, looking at different levels of the system. So this then led to her evolving in her thinking about the fact that we did not and could not just rely on or think about the individual focus, but that we really had to focus on social and population health. We really had to examine how each institution in our society affects the environment, the ecology of individuals. And she really took on the fact that our healthcare system, in a way, contributes to that discrimination, but also can be a promising venue for change into the future. So a major fourth theme has to do with her skills as a transformer, as a translator, and as an interpreter. This was very important in establishing the Center for Health and Community at UCSF 20 years ago, which did help to bring and bridge the biomedical social sciences research and training. And that also contributed to her moving forward in developing the National Program Office for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Evidence for Action program. And this program is particularly important in her crown because it supports research on specific interventions, whether at the policy level, the program level, or the practices level, that has the potential to counteract structural and systemic racism and improve health, well-being, and equity outcomes. And importantly, is to prepare and train the next generation of scholars who can use their lived experience as well as community-engaged research in making structural changes. And the last area that I want to just highlight very briefly is that she recognized the power of the healthcare system to deal with so many aspects of social and behavioral health that influence clinical outcomes. And so she was working very diligently in figuring out what are the kinds of measures and metrics that we need in order to advance what our healthcare system can do in meeting the needs of our patients that go beyond their clinical outcomes. So as I reflect on all of these themes, and I think about how much her work connected all of us, not only in this room, but globally, I think about several additional cross-cutting themes because Nancy was so involved in conducting several social science Manhattan projects. Her dedication to research rigor and intellectual inquiry were such an important element within her being. Her idea of what gets measured gets done was very much at the core of her soul, and how to impact the last large elements in people's lives that are impacted by a variety of social needs that have to be responded to. And what was exciting about seeing her evolution over these years was how committed now she was to the last mile. How do we move from taking the research and really building that research so that it is translated into action, into implementation of new interventions? Research alone is insufficient. I want to move on to almost finishing to say that a key factor of Nancy that we all carry in our hearts was her power as a mentor and as a sponsor. She was definitely a beacon because her integrity, principles, and values drove her actions. She was an advocate for advancing women's academic careers. She was invested in our lives, and she was so caring and empathetic and inspiring and aspirational as well, all at the same time. So these were some of the words that were done, that came out as part of her incredible personal, interpersonal qualities. And I want to comment that as I think about this mosaic that I just shared with you, I really want to acknowledge what were the components, what was the secret glue that really drove so much of this action. So I want to acknowledge the incredible role of her family in everything that she did. This was the most important part of her life, with her devoted Arnie, with her lovely daughters, Sarah, and Sarah's husband, Ariel, Gabby, and Jonah, Sarah, with your baby, Gamma, and your wonderful partner, Sarah, her brother, Richard, and then her two soul sisters, Wendy Everett and Belle Wang. I want to end by thanking you very much for this opportunity to share the love and admiration that I had for my dear friend, Nancy.
So good. That was so good. All right. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo as our lecturer this year for this event. Kirsten is the 17th editor-in-chief of the Journal for the American Medical Association, or JAMA, but she's also the Lee Goldman MD Professor of Medicine and Professor of Epidemiology and Biostatistics here at UCSF. She has previously served as the chair for the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics and was the inaugural Vice Dean for Population Health and Health Equity in the UCSF School of Medicine, which honestly, when that happened, that was a really big deal. And I thought that was a really great, a great person for it, but also something that Nancy cared very much about. She co-founded the UCSF Center for Vulnerable Populations at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital, which focuses on actionable research to improve health equity and reduce health disparities. Dr. Bibbins-Domingo is a general internist and cardiovascular epidemiologist whose research includes observational epidemiology, pragmatic trials, and simulation modeling to examine clinical and public health approaches to prevention in the US and globally. She previously served on the US Preventative Service Task Force and has received kind of a number of accolades, far too many to discuss, though she is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Over the many years that I worked with Nancy, and at Nancy's side, often kind of just discussing research or kind of where the center should go, there were frequent instances when she asked, I wonder what Kirsten thinks. And this was really because she really admired the important role that Kirsten played in driving population health agenda here at UCSF. Kirsten's work has often given a voice to the voiceless. And now, in her role at JAMA, she has a really loud voice. So I want to hear more of it. And so with that, please welcome up Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo.
It's such a pleasure to be here for so many reasons. First of all, obviously, the great honor to lecture in Nancy's name, to be here at UCSF, to see so many of you. Seeing so many of you would be great in and of itself, but I know many of you through Nancy, and the process of preparing for this and thinking about that and seeing all of you is just spectacular. So I'm looking forward to the day. So I want to start with my reflections on Nancy, and I'm thinking of this, I titled this Nancy's Gifts, but these are also Nancy's gifts to us. I think of these sort of in three categories. You know, Nancy was first and foremost a rigorous scientist. And I got to know Nancy when I was early on in my career working with Cardia, which is a big study of young adults that the NHLBI had funded. And I wanted to figure out cardiovascular disease in young adults. I'm a clinician, epidemiologist, but quickly got to realize all of the wonderful ways in which Nancy had led this team of social scientists to put these brilliant measures into this NHLBI data set so that you could start to disentangle those things that people experience early in their life that contribute to health, that are in that social context. Over the weekend, I was at NAM, where Emily Wong was inducted into the National Academy of Medicine, who built her career in part on incarceration and health, in part on a paper that we published together from Cardia that has so many of these wonderful measures in it. And seeing that legacy of Nancy's, of the rigorous science, it is the way I always think first and foremost of Nancy. I also think of Nancy as sort of embodying and embracing that creative tension that comes from working across disciplines. So I watched Harvey Feinberg's lecture when he lectured here last year, and he described Nancy as the premier social scientist of her generation, of our generation. And that is true. And the fact that she's here at UCSF is like everything I love about UCSF and about Nancy. Because Nancy really did embrace sort of the working together, not just being outstanding at her discipline, but working with others so that we together can be better. I hope Eric is actually telling the truth that Nancy said, what would Kirsten think? Because I actually used to always say, what did Nancy think? And Nancy was wonderful as we were starting our centers, as we were starting our initiatives. I would routinely call Nancy and say, well, how do I think about it in a different way? What else do I have to pay attention to? And Nancy, of course, as you know, was very generous. I had the really good fortune to work with Nancy on a National Academies report on integrating social determinants of health into the electronic health record, and sort of walking painstakingly through what measures are good enough. Could they actually go into the electronic health record? She co-chaired this with Bill Stead, and I reread her editorial in the New England on this process. And now this is all that we are talking about, all that we are thinking about, how we take what we know about social factors and actually bringing them more directly into clinical practice. And that work, that is not always easy, as you know, to move outside your discipline, to work together with others who approach the same question in a slightly different manner. This was a real gift that Nancy had. And then I'll end with generosity and hope. And generosity and hope, so I had the good fortune last Friday of being the keynote at an Evidence for Action collaborative that brought together scholars from backgrounds historically marginalized in academia to think about how we reconstruct our body of knowledge to reflect the many experiences we want to have reflected there. When you're the keynote and the editor of JAMA, you're in, and the scholars have taken the whole day before you start talking about how they're going to reconstruct the body of knowledge. You're in for a tense conversation, but it was really a wonderful and invigorating conversation. And that is a program that Amani leads. I got to know Amani through Nancy. And I think people who invest in these programs that really think about those who are early on in their career, to think about where a field is going, you do that because you are hopeful about the future, because you realize that the future is going to look a little different than it does today. And so these are the gifts that Nancy, I think, had in abundance and gives to us. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about journals. This is where I was a month ago. I gave a webinar with the editor-in-chief of Lancet, with the executive editor of the science journals, moderated by Michael Mensa, who's a former UCSF medical student, on the social responsibility of medical and scientific journals. And I want to start off with this because the first three slides, I think, really speak to Nancy's legacy and also the things that I am thinking a lot about in my current role. So I started off by saying, here's what we know. The social context matters for health. Of course, this is Nancy. It matters for the practice of medicine, and it matters for the conduct of science. And we know that the systemic and structural factors that shape this social context and underlie inequities and directly contribute to differences in health, to differences in the way we practice, and differences in the way science is ultimately conducted. Here's also what we know. So journals have a lot of power. Journals historically are the gateway, the gatekeepers, if you will, for great science that's being conducted to make it out into the world have historically happened through journals publishing the science. Right now, in our current environment, we have lots of other ways to publish. You don't have to go directly to a journal. You can post things up on a preprint server. But certainly, journals still have a lot of power, the traditional ones. And journals that have big names and reputations like JAMA have a lot of power, not just because we're the gatekeepers, but because we underscore what's important. What we signal, we say, this is what we have to pay attention to as a field. This is where the research is going. This is what you have to pay attention to in clinical practice. And that is a lot of power. Journals are also shaped by this same social context, and the same systemic and structural factors that underlie inequities also shape journals. And so when I was offered this opportunity to lead JAMA, I had never actually been an editor of any type. Not a baby editor, not a deputy editor, not a section editor, not a special editor, nothing. But I was very interested in how we communicate and ultimately how our science leads to those things that we want to affect, how we improve the lives of our patients, how we improve the health in communities, how we improve population health. And journals really sit at that core, right? Because when journals work well, they are amplifying and really helping that final step to happen. And when they don't, they are reinforcing all of the things that don't work as well as we would like them to work in this great biomedical enterprise. So this is the editorial I wrote on my first month as the editor-in-chief of JAMA. And I had already spent a bit of time with the organization, which is an outstanding organization, but thinking about what we could do better, because of the role that journals have. In this editorial, I reflected a little. We had just come out of the worst of the pandemic, and the worst of the pandemic taught us how great science can be and how oftentimes we fall short in terms of reaching the communities we need to, in terms of not moving fast enough. Journals have a role, as I've said, in trying to help us to do this all better, our collective mission better, and journals have to be at their best to do that. And this is the paragraph that I reflected that was important for me. Insularity and parochialism are threats that must be guarded against because they inhibit the recognition of scientific content with the potential to change practice and translate research into improvements in health. While working to counter these and other threats via editorial processes, it's also paramount that the voices in the room where decisions are made represent diversity of thought, expertise, and backgrounds. The voices of those historically marginalized and excluded from science and medicine have also largely been absent in scientific and medical publishing to the detriment of all. Who is in the room matters. Ensuring diversity is not simply an issue of fairness and equity. It accelerates advances in science, produces better medical journalism, is fundamental to the trust readers place in a journal to deliver the highest quality content and most complete context to advance health. So who is in the room matters. I don't just mean who is literally in the room in Chicago, but also how we think about that extended room of peer reviewers, of authors, of people who ultimately influence how we decide what we publish and how we do that. And so I want to just talk through 3 ways that we have thought about this at JAMA. We want to be thinking always about who. And, for many, and I love being with the scholars last week because they are ready to lead the revolution. I want to remind you that sometimes the revolution has to start with small things. So at JAMA, one of the first people I hired at JAMA is a fantastic scholar in Seattle, a member of the National Academies. Very well recognized scholar who said to me, I realize the responsibility you're placing in me, Kirsten. And I said, oh, why is that? He says, because I've noticed on your masthead, I'm going to be the first PhD scholar on your masthead. And so, yes, you can give me a round of applause for being brilliant enough to hire a PhD scholar. But that's a little bit of what we're talking about. It's very easy for us. It's very easy for journals to really believe we have a responsibility to publish what's important in medicine and to not think through all of the many ways in which other fields are important. Because that itself doesn't even help us to be the best that we can be to evaluate the whole range of science that we have to be good at. whether that's early translational mechanistic science or social behavioral work. There's so many disciplines that are important. So who is in the room matters, and the range of expertise that they have matter. Michael Mensa, who I showed you, who moderated that panel, he's part of our group of JAMA fellows who are spending a year with us, going to our manuscript meetings, understanding what the editorial process is like. They contribute fabulously to the discussions in the manuscript meeting because journals are oftentimes that thing that we know very little about until we're more senior in our careers and can have roles in journals. And yet they have so much of an impact on us early on in our careers. And so getting to understand what journals are just a collection of people trying to make decisions about what to ultimately publish. And so having people who are earlier in their careers who think differently, who are closer to clinical practice, closer to the ideals of what they think are important, has been really quite invigorating for us. And we've really expanded the range of expertise in who we have working with us at JAMA. We made the decision early on, just as a principle of transparency, to report on some of the demographics of our editors and our editorial board members. I think the way that this will ultimately be transformative is that it allows us to be reflective and to see, are we meeting our goals, and for us to internally do those make those hard decisions, but reporting them externally is part of the rigor of the process of doing that. And so we were very pleased to do this, and we've done this with all of the editors across the network. That's why you see so many authors on this paper. We think about this a lot in how we publish. So this would be an example of a phase 3 clinical trial. This is a major Alzheimer's drug that people are talking about. People are very excited about really transforming how we think about Alzheimer's care. We published this phase 3 trial about a year ago. But there are many things that these new drugs will mean for how we think about the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And so we published this phase 3 clinical trial with 4 editorials to try to understand that entire context, to think about the issues about equity, about the way in which who are enrolled in trials doesn't quite match who we really need to reach for Alzheimer's disease, the extraordinary basic work that really underlies these new monoclonal antibodies, amyloid targeting antibodies, and you'll recognize some of these names from UCSF. The issues about health policy and reimbursement for these drugs, which will ultimately be quite expensive. And then, again, you'll recognize some more UCSF names, the geriatricians thinking through, well, what does this mean for how we actually prescribe in clinical practice for the geriatric physicians? This is the way I want us to always be publishing. The science itself is important, and the conversation around the science has to happen simultaneously, not after the fact. It always has to be part of how we think about a particular scientific finding. We've done some of this by putting together theme issues on particular topics of importance. These are just a few that we have done since I've been editor-in-chief. JAMA has a long history of doing these. These include not just more social factors that influence health, but really thinking together about a topic we don't always think about, blood, bleeding, and transfusion, and the collection of ways in which people are thinking about innovative ways in intensive care and emergency settings about bleeding and transfusion, as well as information for patients and information about policies that relate to the blood supply. Most recently, we've published on e-cigarettes, and you've got to love our graphic artists. And then this past Saturday, the new the Declaration of Helsinki, which is the principles that underlie humans in research, the conduct of research in humans, we published that with a variety of other really fabulous content. We also think about it in what we publish. And so we are thinking about not just the science, but also the social context around the science, most recently with our call for papers in the US elections. And also, though, in how we issue guidance for other authors to think about where socially constructed categories like race intersect with genetic studies that are trying to understand the genetic basis for disease, and guidance for how to understand what socially constructed categories mean in this context. And this was a really quite nice work that I think it means a lot for the genetic journals that have to think about some of the challenges of communicating effectively in this regard. We've also tried to have those cross-sector discussions by bringing leaders to our home at JAMA. We launched JAMA Summits just last year. So JAMA Summits, our first JAMA Summit was on clinical trials, and we brought together leaders from a variety of different disciplines to say, why do we not always meet what we want to meet when we're conducting clinical trials? They don't always inform practice the way that they should. These are some of the publications that have come out of those. And just this past week, we had a JAMA Summit on artificial intelligence, again, thinking with leaders across disciplines so that we can really have the conversations, not just with people who think the same as we do, but think about the many ways in which the technology and the clinical sites and the people who have to think about how we understand and do the best for our patients, that we can come together and challenge each other. And these are issues that we'll continue to explore on our pages. What I said in that initial editorial was that this is ultimately important, not just for diversity, for equity, for those things, because they're good to do, but journals are ultimately built on trust. Do you trust that what I'm putting out, what I'm publishing, represents rigorous science? Have we thought collectively about all of the issues? Everything that we do in our biomedical enterprise ultimately rests on whether we trust each other in how we interact, and whether others, the public, funders, trust what we are doing as well. I want to argue that we're in an environment where that trust we should not take for granted. And so I hope you'll indulge me to talk about 3 trends that are happening right now. I'm going to describe them as trends in publishing, but they're trends that are affecting all of you as well. And the only way we address these issues are to think about them together. The first is just to recognize that there are a lot of headlines that look like this. There are a bunch of journals that have been closed down because of fraud. This was in the Wall Street Journal in May. I can look at this and say, well, this isn't JAMA. This is those other terrible journals. You look at this and you say, these aren't papers we've put into the literature. This doesn't apply to us. But when the Wall Street Journal puts a headline out there like this has an impact on all of us in the biomedical enterprise. It does, because people read that and they say, well, can we really trust what UCSF is doing? Can we really trust what's happening here? This isn't just the journal, journals sort of at the margins. We also know you have big headlines here. This is from the Boston Globe, looking at Dana-Farber talking about bad data and saying, is it the journals that messed up? Is it the scientists? Is it the peer reviewers? What's the problem with all you folks over there in this great scientific enterprise? And what I want to argue with you is that we are at a period of time of rising mistrust, right? There is mistrust of science. And that is something that we can say, that's not me, it's not my journal, it's not my science, it's that other field. But that mistrust, it affects how the political discourse around science, it affects the way funders think, it affects many, many things. It is certainly being used as a political weapon by some who benefit from that. But we have to also keep our house in order and recognize that this is on the rise. That's the first trend. The second trend I want to talk about relates to the publication industry And that is, we have a rising number of publications. There are more papers being published every year. And you can say this is the pandemic, because we had a big blip with the pandemic, but this is really a rise that is fueled by a number of things, including the fact that the publishing models right now, because of an interest in making science open, basically people are, there's a rise in the number of open access journals where you pay per publication, right? Now we have an open access journal, and so I'm not trying to speak against open access. I am trying to say that we have to look at this rising number of publications and think about what that means. There's not only a rising number of publications, there are a rising number of large journals that are publishing large quantities of publications. So this is from John Ioannidis, and he just lists here all the journals that publish 3,000 or more papers per year. There are many outstanding journals on this list, many that I have published in, many who I know their editors and they're outstanding. There are also a number of these journals that have been delisted because of predatory practices. You all know you get emails probably once a week from journals that you have no idea what they are, asking for peer review. This is a trend we also have to pay attention to. My colleague who runs one of the preprint servers reminds me that the studies that said that COVID came from volcanoes or snakes or other types of things were all published in the peer review literature. So when you have a rising number of journals, peer-reviewed journals, a rising number of publication, peer-reviewed publication, and we know that many of these journals have been accused of predatory practices. This is not a field now that looks like it's reinforcing trust in what we're doing. Two editors have talked about this, the insatiable pursuit of two currencies, money and publication, have corrupted science, and it's time for a major rethink. This is the former editor of BMJ. This is what he says here is that in Italian, misconduct is usually because of money or sex. But in science, it's money or publications. And basically what he's arguing is academic institutions putting a currency on more and more publications, and that aligning with publishers getting paid per publication is fueling a set of things that are probably not leading us in a good direction. So increasing volume of publications, many fueled by our publishing models that include open access, we have to pay attention to as well. And the third, we'd have to pay attention to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is really going to be a boon for publications. It's going to help us with our manuscripts. It's going to help make many things more accessible for authors and for readers. It's going to help us to find our content. We have tried to give guidance, and we are very bullish on AI. We also know that AI is going to lead to other types of things that are probably not so good. So this is the introduction to this lovely manuscript. Certainly, here is a possible introduction for your topic, right? This is the ChatGPT written manuscript, right? This is a failure of authorship and a failure of editorship. But this is rampant out there right now, right? And when you add this up to the rising number of publications, you can see that this is not moving in quite the direction we'd like. When we gave that guidance to authors, ChatGPT had been indexed on PubMed 3 times already as an author. And so until many of the journals came together and said, no, humans are authors, humans attest to the integrity of the work. These are tools that we encourage people to use, but you have to tell us how you're using them. I won't belabor this. You know that there are limitations to these tools because they hallucinate. This is just describing hallucinated citations. And there's concern, as we're all burdened by peer review, that people are using these more and more for peer review as well. So here's what we worry about in publishing. We worry about that people don't use these correctly because they're not search engines. They do hallucinate. We worry about verification and attribution of content. We worry about fraud. We worried about fraud before. It's not that you need AI to commit fraud. There's plenty of ways to do that without it. But we worry a little bit about fraud at scale, and we worry about fraud specifically with regards to the ways we set up data sets and things like that. So these are three trends: mistrust that is on the rise, increasing volumes of publications, and then this wonderful tool of artificial intelligence that will both help us in so many wonderful ways and also has the potential to make us not quite sure of what it is that we're reading. These are issues of trust. And I speak about them now because I didn't know anything about journals before I started at JAMA. These are issues that we have to think about collectively as a scientific community if we're going to make sure that we keep our house in order as all of these things are happening around us. Nancy's gifts, I think, are still relevant for all of the things that I'm thinking about now, and I think about them a lot and reflected on them again. We have to be committed to the rigorous science as she was. We have to be thinking about how we make sure within our fields where those threats are to science that is not as well conducted as one would like and one can withstand. And that is one of her calls, I think, to us. We have to think together about these trends. When people mistrust a field like science, that is a threat to all of us. And it will require all of us thinking across the different sectors, across our disciplines, about what we can be doing to reinforce the trust that we hope others have in the work that we're doing, which we ultimately believe is about that noble cause of improving health. And I think we have to think in a hopeful way and in a generous way about how we can do this together. There is so much work that needs to be done. I don't mean to bring up the things that I think will be challenging, because I ultimately do have hope if we can think about this together. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you for having this wonderful honor. Sure.
We have time for a few questions if anybody wants to ask. And then maybe you can repeat the question.
Yes, sure. Hey, Rebecca.
Thank you. You've made a real effort to shift the focus and perspective and bring more voices literally or figuratively around the table. I assume to change the approach you use to critique and judge the papers that are submitted. It's a little early, but what do you think the impact's been so far?
You know, so, you know, those early career scholars asked me a similar thing, you know, how can you make change at a journal, right? I think I am happy with how the process has changed. And I think I'm anxious to do more. I think changing the outcomes are harder. And there's so many things about the work of journals, the work of a weekly publication, the work of maintaining the high integrity that doesn't allow you to take risks in certain areas, that really don't allow you to move as fast as you'd want. And so I don't know, and I don't quite know how to measure the outcomes, to be perfectly frank. I do take some comfort in the process. Like I think at the end, you know, I mean, it would be nice to believe that I have some divine power that has made me be able to say when there's a great paper. And journal editors-in-chief have a lot of power within an organization, and that itself is a little daunting, and was daunting to me when I realized that. But what I believe in is the process really of having more voices more people look at a paper and say, yeah, I'm not sure about that thing. Like I trust that method, but that doesn't make any sense with what the field is doing. And I like that that's happening now. And I think we right now have more people doing that. And that affects not just on what we take, but also on how we help to put the context around, well, this is the limitation, but still important because of this. So I like that. But so I really like that. but changing the outcomes, could I say the papers look different, the conversation around them look different? Probably not as fast or as much as anyone would like. And I don't really know how to measure those yet. So.
Hello, thank you. My name's Dr. Seema Hotra. I'm from the UK. I'm a cardiologist. Brilliant lecture, very candid. I really appreciate that. A couple of comments and then some questions. So from everything I've seen in my experience, I think, and I'm also quoting a friend of mine, John Abramson, who you may know, who said that we will not be able to fix health or healthcare until we correct commercial distortions of the scientific evidence. And then to add to that, John Ioannidis, who you obviously referenced as well in 2006 in his paper, Why Most Published Research Finding the Faults, said the greater the financial interest in a given field, the less likely the research findings to be true. Medical journals are often used as vehicles to for the use of pharmaceutical industry interests in that note. So my question to you is, one, how do you as an editor manage those commercial conflicts, especially when these medical journals, a lot of them take a huge amounts of money from the drug industry? And then if we decide and think, well, actually enough is enough because of all of the misinformation that comes through to the public from these articles that are essentially fraudulent, is there an alternative funding model?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And let me tell you a little bit about JAMA's history that holds us in good stead, but also things that we've had to change. So we have 2 editors ago, the editor at JAMA took a very strong position on this. And so I think we probably have the strongest policy on declared conflicts of interest, putting conflicts of interest or interests people have on the front page of the article, not buried in an appendix, thinking in more deliberate ways about that. It had become so extreme, though, at JAMA that sponsored studies wouldn't come to JAMA. They wouldn't come to JAMA. And I'm in the position where I have to say, do I want to publish a sponsored study? Make sure that it's rigorously reviewed. Make sure that I'm going to hold those publications to the conclusion that I think is the conclusion that is supported by the science. And then put other context around it. Or should I say, I'm more suspicious of those commercial entities and I'm happy to have them go somewhere else. We've decided on the former, and that's what I believe. The reality is there are a lot of interests and there are a lot of more hidden commercial interests. When a company sends me a paper, I sort of know where their interests are. I do. The reality is there's been so much regulation that's taken place over the last 2 decades. I oftentimes have an easier way to interrogate the methodologies, to understand where the data is, to think about all of these things than I do for many other types of studies. I am not trying to dismiss what you are saying. I am not at all. In fact, I will tell you the way we have had to let go of studies has not to do with the methodology in the paper, has to do with what a company wants to put as the first line in the abstract. And so we've let papers go that have come down to the stretch. We're about to publish them, and they'll say, "Well, we're not going to put the adverse events in the abstract." And I'm like, "Well, we're not publishing without the adverse events. For a diabetes drug that has hypoglycemia as an adverse event, not going to put that." And we've let papers go at the last minute. So, but the question is now, when you play within the game, like you're going to be willing to publish the studies. Is that a more dangerous position to be in? Do you know what I mean? Because you're sort of, and that is the challenging environment that we're in. I will tell you right now, companies have so much control over the communications market thing, they will publish science by press release way before they're publishing in a journal anyway. And so I think my responsibility as a journal, if 70% of the trials are sponsored by a company, I can't sit back and say, yeah, I'm really not playing that game. I have to be in that game. I have to, that's my contribution to the integrity of the scientific publication, because they have so many other tools to science by press release. And there are other journals who are going to maybe pay less attention to, what goes in the conclusion. I'd rather be in that game because I know that. And then I would acknowledge there are a lot of more hidden interests that oftentimes are not as clear. And so, but I know that this is a dangerous game and I could get burned. So it's, yeah, I'm not disagreeing at all. Oh, sorry. Oh, please.
One of the unrecognized benefits of fraudulent research being identified is the opportunity for journal editors to encourage the training of algorithms that can identify papers near deeper scrutiny of the data set.
Yes. Yeah, I am very encouraged by, I mean, it is one of the things that I'm very interested in with AI, is like making sure that we have the tools and we've been thinking a lot, vendors are always trying to sell us the tools, but we're also thinking in-house about how we build our tools so that these tools are an extension of the editorial process. They don't replace an edit. Humans still make decisions in journals, just like expect humans to author papers, but that we can learn from them and do them. I think you will hear most editors say the thing that they worry most about is the wholesale construction of data. Creating data, I think would still be a challenge. There are ways, but if you were sophisticated at doing that, I think there would be challenges. But I think right now it's an area we're actively thinking about.
I think this comment has less to do with JAMA than other journals, but there is a sense in the academic community that the academic publishing enterprise is really broken.
Yeah.
And Elsevier is reporting profit margins in 2023 of 40%, where fossil fuels at 8% or 7% or something. Yep. And there are two big problems. One is that reviewers are just not wanting to review for free.
Yep.
And when I was a journal editor, we would send a paper to 5 people, and we'd usually get 2 or 3 pretty good quality reviews. Now editors are telling me they're sending them to 20 people to get one or 2 warm bodies to review.
Yes.
And then the second issue is that authors can't pay these author processing charges.
Yes.
And Nature is up to over $10,000
yes.
now. And so I was just wondering about this. There might be alternative models. In the old days, university presses published journals, and somewhere around the 1970s, commercial publishers came in and said, hey, we'll take this off your hands. It's too much for you to print and bind things and mail them and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's no printing and binding and mailing. And that, just wondering how you feel about that, and if these alternative models are things we should consider.
Yeah, part of the reason I like to give these talks at academic institutions is because I 100% agree with you, and we cannot make a change unless all of us think about how to make a change. So the good news for me at JAMA is that we're published, we have the publishers in-house, right? So we as a business, the editorial and publishing team, they pretty much have the same mission, because we have to get our 13 journals. They don't publish any other journals. I have to figure out how they make the business work. We have to figure out together how we have great content. That's what it relies on. And we have a lot of flexibility, because I can go down the hall and say, I want to publish this special issue. I want to make this free, even though, and they will figure out, how we do that, right? So we have that. I think we have to acknowledge right now that the open access model, while openness and transparency is good for science, the open access model of the pay per article is not moving in the right direction. It aligns incentives in terrible ways. And I will say, I do have concern about the roles of these big commercial publishers who both control the subscriptions at the libraries and also paradoxically have the highest open access fees. It's terrible. And when I look at some of the small societies, the medical societies, you know, when those publishers decide that journal is not the journal they need anymore, there's nothing that keeps those journals going. There's nothing. And so people will ask me about things that are symptoms of the problem, that we don't pay peer reviewers. Yes, it's terrible. But the burden on peer review has also to do with all of those millions of journals that have now sprung up. The fact that I talk to junior people and they tell me, I gave a talk at UCLA and a person earlier in their career said, yeah, I only review about 4 or 5 times a month. And I'm like, oh God, don't review 4 or 5 times a month. And I also know she's really unlikely to be reviewing for JAMA. She's unlikely to be reviewing for a journal that she's publishing in, because nobody knows with all of those. So the problem, yes, we don't compensate peer review in a way it should be compensated. We have been trying to do many things to recognize it to deans or to recognize it on our master to do other things. But paying peer reviewers, that problem is, it's like a symptom of the overall broken enterprise. And I think what we tend to do is find that symptom that we don't like and is terrible and is burdensome. And yes, it's horrible. But the whole thing is pretty broken if we have people who are early in their careers who are reviewing so many papers for journals they're not going to publish and shouldn't publish in. That's also not good, right? That's not good for our enterprise. And so I think we do have to have frank conversations, and it does need to start, I believe, at the universities to say, not just we like open science, I'm all in favor of it, but we have to think like, what does it mean to, when are these forces against the integrity for our field, which ultimately we have to be invested in preserving.
We have time for one more question. Thank you.
Julia?
Go for it. Definitely 2 more.
Julia? Yeah.
So I was just curious that you said that with this role was the first time you've sort of been on
Yeah.
the other side. And so do you think now, knowing what you know, if you go back and think back to your time when you were in your active research producing phase,
Yeah.
you would have done anything differently?
Oh, that's such a great question. You know, having been on the other side, it makes me appreciate what great mentorship I had. So one of the first papers that I published was in JAMA, and it was a paper that was rejected. And I had a great Mary Hooley, who you know, many of you know, and she said, we're going to call the editors and talk to them. And I was like, what in the world are you talking about? But they had a wonderful, generous editor got on the phone with us. And he said, look, here's the problem. He's like, you've done this, but like when JAMA publishes something, people change their practice because of that. So we're not sure about this part. And I was like, oh my God, I get what it is he wants me to do. And we did a whole bunch of other things around it. And so, and we eventually got it published. And I always think back to both great mentorship and also a great editor who really explained like why the journal had made that decision. And I think that is what journals should do. Like that, we should all be part of that. We're part of that same process, right? It's hard to do at scale. We're trying to figure out how to do that at scale. But I want more people to have that experience.
Kirsten.
Yes.
Hey.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good.
Thanks for once again enlightening us, and welcome home.
Thank you.
So as I'm thinking about the trends that you outlined, trust, increasing number of publications,
Yeah.
and AI, I wonder how you all at the journal are thinking about what might be the underlying principle or concept or trend behind them. And to me, it's the way fundamentally how human beings are now learning. right? So I think the case could be made that we may be at an inflection point in human learning analogous to what happened in the 15th century with the printing press, because the combination of the internet, the iPhone, and now AI is truly changed. I mean, you just look at our students and how they're learning, right? At every level. So you referred a couple of times to the trends and how JAMA needs to keep the house in order. Can you dive a little bit further into that? Like, what are the discussions, if any, that you're having about these potential inflection point? The fact that people aren't reading entire articles from beginning to end, and they're getting tidbits and they're getting it off of ChatGPT.
Yeah.
What,
That's a great question. So my view is that traditional journals, peer-reviewed journals like ours, in some way have to do the core functions that we've always done as well as we've ever done them, right? Vetting the science, getting the peer reviews, getting the understanding, is this good? Can we trust this? Should we publish this? How should we publish this? What else has to be done? We have to get that right, and we have to keep getting that we have to do that as well as we ever, as good as we ever have. And then we have to do the thing that most journals are not that great at, is being like a modern communication machine, right? To say that we're not publishing just for the scientist, we're publishing for the clinician who probably doesn't want to read the whole methods section. They just want to trust that we've published it, and they want to understand the findings. We're publishing for patients and patient advocacy groups and health system leaders who are trying to make decisions. And when we are concerned about, like, terrible information on YouTube or on the internet, we have to be on all of those platforms and putting out that information in the way people are reading. We might want to say, I hate to break it to all of you, but any of you who are medical educators, the med school class are getting their information on TikTok. They are. You may not like it, they are. And so if we're not on TikTok, if we're not on those platforms, then there are a lot of other people putting out medical, health, scientific information. And so I think we have to do that. We have to be a modern communication vehicle. We have to think in all those ways that allow interesting information to rise above the noise of all the stuff. When I started it, but it's a shift. When I started at JAMA, I would say, I can't read this article, or there's something wrong with this article. And people would say, yeah, it's just Kirsten, she reads on her phone. No one else in the world reads on their phone. And I'm like, everyone reads on their phone. Everyone reads on their phone. Editors don't read on their phone. They read on computers because their editors are sitting, but like every clinician, they're like, well, it's not because I'm younger. It's like everyone reads on their phone. But it's an example. Like, we have to be that good. We have to be that good. And especially journals like ours, that really, we're trying to reach that clinical translation. That's ultimately what we are. So my colleagues who run preprint servers, I love preprint servers. I actually think lots of science should be on preprint servers. But what clinical journals do, there's a lot that we do, and we say, no, the adverse events have to be there. We have to emphasize those, because when I want that clinician to read it, or that health system trying to make decisions about that drug, they have to read that. And that does take editorial work. And it does take us doing that the way we always should be doing that, even if we're always going to let things go on preprint servers or other things ahead of time. So that's the conversations. Whether we get there, we'll have to see.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was amazing. I love that story about calling the editor, and I guess, like, just give out your number. I mean, UCSF bonus right there. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move to the panelist portion of this. I think it's going to be really amazing, because we have some really amazing speakers who are going to join us. Actually, just come and join. You know who you are. Join us up at the front, and I'll introduce all of them. So Nancy had countless mentees, both formal and informal. I mean, many of us in this room sought her sage advice. I can confirm, Kirsten, that I was telling the truth, that she often sought yours. You'll have to share. And this was done over, years and years and years. So, you already heard that Nancy directed kind of the premier health psychology training program for over 30 years, as well as directing the UCSF site for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholars Program, which some of us were involved in, including myself. And so we're going to hear a little bit about how Nancy's, essence, her wisdom, her kind of what made her so special as a mentor and a scientist, shaped the thinking of these individuals as they went through their careers, and how that still that residue is still so key and fundamental to kind of the work that they're doing now. And so I want to introduce each of them, and then I have some questions, and maybe we'll even open up to you guys if you have specific questions. So first we have Dr. Elizabeth Ozer, who's a professor of pediatrics and associate vice provost in faculty equity here at UCSF. Next to her, we have Dr. Alyssa Epple, who's a professor in the Sarlo Ekman Endowed Chair in the Study of Human Emotion and the Vice Chair of Psychology Research and Diversity, Health Equity, and Community. She's also the Associate Director for the Center for Health and Community. Next to her is Dr. Nikki Bush, who's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and Pediatrics. She's also the Lisa and John Pritzker Distinguished Professor of Developmental and Behavioral Health and the Director of the Division of Developmental Medicine at UCSF. And then next to her is Dr. Amani Nero-Jeter, who's a professor in community health sciences and epidemiology, and the chair of UC Berkeley Division of the Academic Senate. And she's also the director of the Evidence for Action program, which is a national program that you heard about of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And then finally, Dr. Matthew Pentel, who's an associate professor in the Division of Pediatric Hospital Medicine in the Department of Pediatrics here at UCSF. So before we get with the questions, can we give them a round of applause? Thank you for joining us. Amazing, amazing. All right, so I think we all want to hear about how Nancy's influenced you, and maybe some anecdotes, maybe some specialness. And I'll start with you, Elizabeth. What role did Nancy play in your early development as a scholar? Back in the beginning of your career.
Yeah, and I think you had given. I'm sorry, am I on? You had given us the three little quips, and I think I might merge some of those.
Do it.
That's all right.
Yeah.
He said, keep it brief, but here's a few things. So I'll try to do both of those things.
You can do it.
So I think I'm the first because I think I am maybe the oldest, but so I had just gotten a PhD in counseling and health psychology at Stanford, which was a very early programs in health psychology. And I came to UCSF because of Nancy. She had just started, I was the very first cohort in the new NIMH Health Psychology, Psychology and Medicine program. So it was because of Nancy that I came, and actually in no small part because of Nancy that I stayed. And I would say it was a little ironic because when I was finishing my postdoc, Nancy really encouraged me to take some more traditional tenure track offers because she thought that would probably be a less challenging path for a psychologist. But because of my 2 years really being mentored by Nancy, I saw a path for myself in the health sciences that I would actually never have seen had I not come to do this postdoc with Nancy. And here I saw this impeccably trained social psychologist really being able to apply theory and research to being part of and having such a huge impact on really the national and international health discussions, as well as policy. And I was around the table in those early discussions on SES and health and the latter, and seeing how Nancy's work on abortion and decision-making was really being used in policy. And so I was quite inspired by that back then, and that has actually continued to inspire and motivate me in my career in adolescent health, which has often been quite transdisciplinary. as well. So should I just a couple more comments?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
So I also would say that the way in which Nancy approached research with that sort of strategic and intentional thinking is what I saw modeled in pretty much all of Nancy's discussions. Some of these were in faculty meetings, but more specific to me, in terms of a mentee, I think many of you know this, certainly know this part of Nancy, where she would sit back and she would listen intently, and then she would just hone in with just the most, strategic and useful point. And you'd be kind of like, wow, and there were so many times where that perspective that she gave me really was helpful in thinking through, times when I was uncertain or times when I was trying to make career decisions. And I have one little kind of funny Nancy anecdote, but I carry it with me. We were sitting across a table having a cup of coffee, and I was an assistant professor, and I was telling her a little about, my trials and my tribulations, and that I had gotten this small grant. And I was kind of, putting it down. It's okay. It's a small grant. It's whatever. And Nancy just came right back at me and said, well, it's better than a kick in the pants. And I'm like, you're right. You're right. And I think it was sort of that support, and that, while she's being strategic, she's also being like, hey, get some perspective, Elizabeth, And then my actual last one-on-one conversation with Nancy, which I did not know was going to be my last conversation. She called me because we were both reviewing, we were part of the bridge funding and the School of Medicine, and we were reviewing a similar, the same applicant. And it was a little bit complicated and a little unclear whether this was really the right vehicle for this person, etc. And so Nancy called and said she just wanted to really talk it through with me. And I remember thinking, here's Nancy, who, obviously all the leadership positions, everything she had going on. And yet she was approaching this with such carefulness, such thoughtfulness, and such caring. I mean, she really wanted to make sure that we did right by this person. And I just felt so lucky that this had been a person that I'd been able to model and learn from for so many years. Just in that moment, I was like, this is incredible. And I just want to end with one last little anecdote that when I was a postdoc, we would sit around in this seminar that Nancy led. And she was trying to tell us that, no, you can't present 15 things in a presentation. We were going over our talk. And she said, really 3 would be enough, right? Just stick to this. And it was around Passover, and somehow this morphed into, that would be enough, die new. And some of you who are in the room may know, who have been my mentees, that I have used that phrase. I have channeled that both with people I mentor, as well as many aspects of my own life. But I would also say, if Nancy had accomplished a quarter of what Claire went over here at the beginning with that beautiful overview, I would say die new.
Excellent. Great job. All right, Alyssa, how has Nancy kind of imprinted on you in your career?
Nice to sit next to Elizabeth. We were, for those of you who've been here for more than 30 years, we started off on the 7th Avenue UCSF building where they housed all the PhDs, the social and behavioral sciences. And I had the really great luck of landing my first job after college at UCSF, because I was absolutely going to medical school, near Nancy's office. And so it was the presence and the role modeling of Nancy that has affected all of us, whether we were her mentee or just interacted with her. So it was very clear to me very early on that Nancy was she was the crux of the wheel. She was the center of a new field, health psychology. And so through reading her, the first book on health psychology, the world lit up in front of me, the opportunities of applying the biopsychosocial model in medicine, which really was absent at that time. And so I went to graduate school in health psychology. I beelined back to work with Nancy as a postdoc, had the good luck again of having an office near her. She, in the meantime, had kind of leveled up 5 levels. She had the Center for Health and Community. She was now at the crossroads of the world of population health. She was the ambassador. Her door was open. And what I saw was people from students internationally to senior leaders come through her door. I can't believe the people I met, who she just met with on a daily basis. So she was a mentor to all. And one thing that she modeled was that she was tending to the fields, the many fields that and movements that she developed really internationally, but at the same time, she cared so deeply about home, about UCSF, and leaving her imprint, and was so excited when Matt State came as a partner to really make change in our department. And home, and her personal home, her deepest joy. We would get to hear little bits now and then about her family. So seeing how much she could care and plant seeds in these 3 places was, you know, she was an incredible role model. So I think I'm gonna stop there and give everyone else a chance. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, Nikki, please.
So I brought notes in case I lost track of myself here, but I was the first in my family to go to finish college, and no one helped me with my college application. No one helped me with my graduate school application. And my CV, when I sent it to Nancy for her postdoc, was probably one of the weakest she had seen. I only had a couple of publications. And yet Nancy saw something in my questions and my lived experience, and she and Tom Boyce just gave me a chance to work that out in this context here at UCSF. And it was transformative for anyone who knows my career. I've come a long way since that year in 2007, but it was such an incredible privilege to work with someone who was among the first PhDs in leadership at a medical school. As a woman, the gender equity issues are still there, of course, but they were very prominent when I came into this place. And she also was a mother and very proud to be a mother and spoke openly about it. And so just from the beginning of being around her, she cracked this possibility open for me and was an exemplar of, you know, who I could potentially be, having some of that shared identity. And now, you know, Eric, you know, listed off titles. I have a lot of titles that PhD women who have children at home and a lot of caregiving responsibilities often haven't had in medicine. And so I think just that alone, her seeing that potential in someone with a different background and her being that kind of ceiling breaker, but she did it with such grace and class. One of the things I think I had the privilege of upgrading my office to be 2 doors down from Nancy. It was sort of like, how close could you get to Nancy? And the CHC was, at least for me, it was a really big deal.
That was big.
That was big, right? Just to kind of maybe have her pass by your door, or maybe when you were going to the bathroom, you passed by hers and, you know, you had a little moment with her. Each one of those moments was so priceless. And I just want to name a few things that really were poignant for me. You know, I stopped by her office one day and she was talking about this opportunity to do some consulting. Was I interested? You know, probably was a volunteer consulting gig. You know, like, okay, what is that? And it ended up being an opportunity in Memphis, and Kyle Wen and I went and tried to learn a little bit about this cohort in Memphis of 1,500 women who were pregnant, and they had data and spent $10 million on it, but they didn't really know what to do with it. It was philanthropy funded. That ended up being the Candle cohort, and it completely changed Kaya and I's careers. And for 13 years, it's been a huge source of publication. We're now leaders in the NIH ECHO consortium because in part of that progress and work. And those moments of being around Nancy and her saying, hey, I have a little something that might be interesting. Now, it was an unpaid volunteer consulting gig for a year, and I complained to her about how I thought it was kind of shady. And she said, sometimes these things turn into really amazing career-changing opportunities, so you might want to stick it out and see what happens. So she had that wisdom. I mean, she gave me like a gift, and then she made sure I didn't misunderstand the opportunity that was there. There was moments like that. And also, she was running a pregnancy intervention with Alyssa and Barbara, and I talked to them so much about it. And both Alyssa and Nancy at one point, I kept saying, well, why aren't you studying the babies? And they're like, well, you should study the babies. And I was like, I can't study the babies. I'm a baby, But through time, just pushed people who had ideas to take risks and to go big. And part of it was that no one was studying babies born to pregnant women, and no one was particularly interested at UCSF. Maybe if you were in neonatology, but not where I was working, in children and child development and typical development and social determinants in early childhood were not a thing at the time. And one thing that was amazing about Nancy is she showed that you don't just pick science based on what is being published or what is well respected, but you pick it based on what drives you, and that social justice can be a primary centering factor in your work, but it better be rigorous and it better be top notch, and you better get the right people at the table and do it correctly. But that I felt like, I could do science. If it can be around that, I can do science. But then the other thing I'll just add is that she also always answered the phone when I was in her office, and especially if it was one of her children. And I would sit there and be like, I only have 14 minutes with Nancy. She's on the phone. Like, And I would hear about the lunch thing or the homework question or this or that. And in that moment, I didn't fully appreciate it, but it was such a gift of mentorship because she always prioritized the well-being of her relationships and her family and of her children. And for me, that was almost more important than most of the other things she taught me, because so few people modeled that for me. And I have my own children, and I learned so much listening to her speak to you guys. Not very often, don't feel too voyeuristic, but she just really prioritized the love of her children and husband and partners and in friendship. So that was really powerful. And then I'll leave one last anecdote, which is that I would sometimes lament to her about struggles, whether they be, something not working out or feeling like I didn't fit in because of my background. I didn't know if I could be this person I was expected to be in a context, or whether someone would judge me. And she said, she always had a story, really quiet and chill vibe about it. She's like, I almost didn't graduate Wellesley. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, well, I couldn't pass deportment. And for those who don't know, they apparently, according to Nancy, women had to be able to pass all these etiquette and like walking across the room with the book balanced on your head without dropping it was a criteria for graduating at the time. And she said she tried and tried and tried for days, and her professor was just so exasperated with her. And she was like, Nancy, you've got to figure this out. You got to practice. And she couldn't do it. And she said her professor looked the other way and passed her. And she was so relieved, but that sometimes you can't always be who you want to be or something. And there's so much message in that statement. She was sharing with me gender inequities, ridiculous social class issues, so many things that she had to overcome to be who she is. And yet also like humor and levity. And she, can you imagine if she hadn't graduated, what the world would have been robbed of? But I just, it was a beautiful story that I carry with me whenever I'm a little not classy or don't know the right thing to say or drop the book while I'm walking across the podium. And I just want to thank her for that in my life.
Monty, you are now, you took over Evidence for Action, right? So you have a big role to fill here.
No pressure.
No pressure. No pressure. All pressure.
So what I'll start by saying is that, so I came to UCSF after just finishing my PhD at Johns Hopkins. I was trained by a social demographer and was studying kind of high level, macro level social factors and their influence on health. So income inequality, racial residential segregation, kind of ecological level mortality, racial differences in mortality, but at the state and metropolitan statistical area level. And When I left Hopkins, I was carrying this banner of like fist in the air, like place matters. It's all about place. People don't matter at all. It's all about place. And then I came to UCSF as part of the inaugural cohort in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholars Program. And Nancy gently ushered me into understanding that people matter. And I was always saying, it's all about place, it's all about place. But we were housed in the same suite with the health psychology program. And so Nancy made sure that I talked to those folks and started to gain an appreciation for people. Now, I was really interested in kind of, like I said, place and health, but also trying to better understand how that turned into things like mortality or infant mortality, cardiovascular disease, et cetera. So very interested in this concept of embodiment. And I had been reading some stuff on allostatic load and was very intrigued by that, but was still very much at the like high level population science exposure level. And I really do credit Nancy with helping me understand and introducing me to the field of health psychology and helping me marry those kind of broad population health science questions with stress physiology. I didn't know those terms when I came to UCSF, and she helped me understand the connection between people and place and the connection between the mind and the body. And it was through that exposure that really led me to the career that I have now in social epidemiology, but really trying to better understand racism as a social and structural determinant of health in the psychobiology of stress, the connection between those things. She really nurtured those interests for me, and she did it in a very genteel way. And so I've always appreciated that about her. And I would say that if I never met Nancy, my career would be completely different. I don't know what it would be, but I definitely wouldn't be studying what I'm studying now. So I really appreciate that about her. I will also say that she believed in me at a time, I finished Hopkins and I was like, at some point, they might come back and say, oh, we forgot, we weren't supposed to give that to you, that degree. And so I was always like, was I really supposed to graduate? And Nancy, so that imposter syndrome that many of us carry when we first finish, and Nancy believed in me at a time where I think I lacked confidence in myself as a scholar, being mentored by someone like Nancy. And I can remember early on in my postdoctoral fellowship getting a rejection for a paper. And I was crushed, I was devastated. And I think Nancy saw that, although I probably tried to hide it. And so I just went to the bathroom. And when I came out of the stall, Nancy was standing there. Nancy was standing there and she had a statistic, I don't remember what it was. And she said, Amani, X% of women who receive a paper rejection, it takes them 6 months to turn around a revision. And then she gave me the same statistic for men. And she said, don't do that. Don't do that. Turn this paper around. You're good enough. There are all kinds of reasons why papers get rejected. And just that, first of all, she followed me into the bathroom, right? Like that was the first thing in terms of Nancy caring, right? She wasn't just a brilliant scholar and scientist. You felt like she cared about you. And it was important to her that I believed that I could have the career that I wanted to have. And so helping me through, I think, some of those early crises of confidence and believing that I could really do it and staying on me until I submitted that revision. I've so appreciated that. And another anecdote I'll say, just in terms of the sustainability, the staying power of Nancy's brilliance, and some of the most basic questions she would ask as a scholar. So I have taught social epidemiology at Berkeley for many, many years, and would often change my syllabus over time, kind of adding new papers, but there were some papers that I would never take off of my syllabus. And I remember showing my syllabus to someone else who was a mentor of mine much later on. And she said, why do you have all these old papers on your syllabus? And I said, Socioeconomic status and health, the challenge of the gradient. You think I'm going to take that off my syllabus? Right? Like these seminal pieces that Nancy wrote at that point, probably not super early in her career, but on the one hand, very simple and basic, but on the other hand, so seminal, so earth-shatteringly transformative for the field of population health. And that paper is still on my syllabus 20 years later, and it still has the same impact on students today as it did for me when I first read it over 20 years ago. And the last thing I'll say is that this is the other thing about kind of Nancy and the way that she really believed in you and let you know that she believed in you. So when I got the email for her asking me to take over as director of E4A, I was really stunned and was a little scared to say yes, because I would be taking over for Nancy. And there's no way that I could do the kinds of things that Nancy did. And so Erin Hagan, the deputy director of E4A, she and I talked, and I thought about, I didn't get a chance to talk to Nancy. Nancy said in the email, if you have any questions, email me. And I did not know what her state of health was at the time. And I reached out a few times and I didn't hear back from her. And Erin explained to me that I may not hear back from her, but her email was long and very precise. And in that email, she explained to me why she felt like I was the right person to take over for her. And Nancy and I didn't talk every day, but every now and then I would call her for some advice about something. And for her to still be thinking about me after all these years and to believe that I was the person to step into that role was so humbling and also just so Nancy. And so that was another one of those times, even recently, just within the past, I've only been at Evidence for Action a little over a year, where still those questions about, can I do it? When those questions come, she was still injecting that confidence within me. And so I'm so grateful for her leadership, for her tutelage, for her confidence in me when I didn't have confidence in myself. And so I'm so honored to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Matt.
Oh, wow, it's a very, very tough panel to follow. All right, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to spend a lot of the time on anecdotes, but I will say that I first met Nancy when I was a joint medical program student at Berkeley and UCSF, which is sort of a combined, you do a master's in health and medical science and do a thesis and also do a MD at UCSF. And it's funny, like looking back on it, I have no idea why Nancy took a meeting with me. And it just goes to show how she just is so kind and so focused on people and giving to people she meets with that, here I'm a medical student. And, some people were like, you should reach out to Nancy. And I was like, oh, sure, that sounds good. I'll reach out to this huge giant in the field. And she was like, yeah, why don't you come by and we can talk. And I was, I really looking back and I'm like, I can't believe how unprepared I was for this meeting to knowing, but she was so great. And she was like, yeah, why don't we do this summer project together? And we, I worked with her throughout med school, throughout residency, then early faculty, and helping with getting my first, grants, my career development award. So it's very much, and as Dr. Rosa was saying, I stayed at UCSF many times. I was thinking, for residency, should I go somewhere else? Should I rank? And I was like, but then I would leave Nancy, and she's so great to work with. It would just be, and she would always be there. But I just love working with Nancy. And I was looking at fellowships, research fellowships. And I remember talking with my dad, and he was like, do you want to do this research fellowship or just the Nancy Adler fellowship? You're working with, why would you leave this great? So, I mean, she is, without her, I would not be in this position that I have and focusing on, implementing social drivers of health screening in clinical settings and leveraging the EHR to do it. And I think just to show, I think, and my department chair isn't here, so you won't hear this and how unproductive I might have been since then. But my thesis that I wrote with Nancy, who was advising me on it, is still It is the most published or cited paper I have today by a landslide. And that's not because, it's not because of me. It's because of the mentorship of Nancy and meeting with a med student and going over this and going over the rigor is the word that came up and has come up so often, but just the rigor of the method, it stood the test of time for my career. Okay, but quick anecdotes because I can't go without them. I think The Office, Nikki, like you said, so I was lucky enough, Nancy gave me some office space right next to her, and that was so fun because just the walking by, the quick interactions, they were precious. Plus, I got to see her desk and my desk were similar sometimes. She had papers all over the place on her desk sometimes. So I don't want everybody to know this, but I felt very good as someone who also had papers, and she knew where everything was. But I was like, thank goodness you are human, even though you are this giant. But I think one of my favorite stories that I actually didn't think about until people were talking today is speaking of the offices, and I just thought it was a great metaphor for this person. And as Claire said, a gentle giant. Like Nancy came over to my office one day, which was kind of unheard of. I would go by there, even though we were literally right next to each other. She came. So after I was chief resident, they gave me one of these. And again, no offense to anybody who has these chairs, but they gave me one of those wooden academic chairs with like the UCSF, and I was like, whoa, this is like a symbol of academia. I've seen these in fancy places. Like, this is awesome. Like the symbol of achievement in academia. And again, this is no shade. These are great chairs and given out as these huge, and so I was grateful to get it. And so I put it in my office, and I proudly had this chair. It's the one chair that I had besides my chair. So Nancy came over to talk to me about a paper and sat in this chair. And I was talking to her, and mid-sentence, she was like, I'm sorry, this chair is very uncomfortable. And I can't focus on what you're saying. Why do you have this chair in your office? Have you sat in this chair? And I was just like, this is the perfect metaphor for someone who's just creating her own path in academia and medicine, saying like, why do we have to do things like this? This does not make any sense. And so after that, I think I put a pillow on the chair, but she never used it again. The other thing I think what was great is Nancy, as I do think everybody's touched on the note of mentorship and sponsorship, and really, I agree. I think Nikki, you were saying she really had this way of saying, this committee might change your life, but this you need to get some focus and the wisdom she brought with it. But I think is really something that I don't know how she did, but was always right. And I think. Again, when I was sort of early in my career as a med student, I loved doing things and running these analyses, and was really excited to be on all these projects, which was great. But I also found out that there was like a Nancy, the enforcer, that I didn't know about, which was really funny because one day there was one of our colleagues at the CHC, who everybody knows, who I won't name, and approached me and said, Matt, I know you love running these stats. Why don't we run something on this and these models? And I was running them and I was sending output. And this is when I was a med student. And then I saw him again a few months later, and I was like, I'm sorry, I'm behind on this, And he was like, don't worry about it. I'm like, really, I can do it. It's just I've been on these rotations. He's like, Nancy talked to me. She said, Matt, this is actually, I was a resident. She said, Matt is a resident right now. He needs to focus on his clinical career and becoming a good clinician. When he's done with that and has time, he can do whatever. You can ask him if he can do what you want him to do. And I was like, oh my gosh, like Nancy, from The Sopranos, like behind the scenes, like I know it, but it was very, but I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't tell her to do that. It was like, and we all loved her, right? But it was just, Nancy was just such a kind and sort of like, and generous mentor and sponsor, and was just really wanted to protect people to do what she thought that they wanted to do. It was always what was best for the person, which was incredible. And the last one I'll end with, I promise, real quick, but I can't not mention this, is I remember my first year as faculty, and I'm doing like 24-hour shifts, and then I'm then going to the CHC to write papers. And I remember one day I was just in the zone, had some coffee, I got this data set. I did an analysis in a day, and I wrote a paper. I was there till probably 7 p.m. And I sent it to Nancy, all excited. And I got this is why I have my phone. The response, I got an email back a few days later. And the title of the subject was "Complicated Response to Paper." And the first line was, it was Matt. I read your paper and have mixed feelings. And she went on to say, she was like, the first thing I thought was, wow, it's incredible. You did this in a day. Oh my gosh, like so interesting. But it is really not that. She didn't say it like this, but it was garbage. She was like, you really, you need to take the time. And what she went on to explain in very, wonderful language is about, you're early in your career. This is a precious time to think about what you really want to do and to give you the space to really think about it and not just, cave to the pressure of publishing whatever is easy and out there. Take the time, do the science, do the rigorous thing. And she was like, I want you to have the space to do it. So let's figure out how you can do that. So you're doing great work. And then of course she gave me this attachment, which I love and I keep and I look at frequently. She was like, this will help explain what I was thinking. And it was this article. She said, this is an article I read early in my career and sort of framed how I have done research throughout my career. And it was called How Agassiz Taught Professor Scudder. And basically, it's this paper talking about an entomologist who goes to study under a professor of natural history. And the first page, they say that the mentor says to him, look at this fish. Tell me what you see. I'll be back in a little bit. And the guy says after 10 minutes, I saw everything there was to know about this small little fish, this Hamelon fish after 10 minutes and was done with it. So he has the mentor come back. He says, I found it. It's got 2 gills. It's got this, that. He's like, no, look at it again. And he makes this person look at this fish for hours, then for days, then for weeks. He's like, that's great, you're getting it, but look, there's more. And he goes back and looks at the fish for over a week. And then finally the mentor says, you're really starting to see the fish. And this professor of entomology says, this was one of the best lessons I ever got about how to really get into something and not just take a superficial pass, but get deep into it. I'm getting emotional. I'm a crier. This is, but it was just such a precious gift. And I think it's interesting today. I've read that email a lot and I've sent it to a few mentees, but it had also, I think what people talked about, how she set an example of being a mentor. And it was such a gift for that. So I will say the last thing she said, I saw, I'll get through it. The last reply she had on it was a reply that said, I'm sure you will become an Agassiz and grow into this someday.
Thank you all for the panel. That was amazing. You guys we're gonna move on to the awards. The awards.
That last question about her advice.
If you have one loaded. Yeah. No, sure. I don't want to break that up.
Call and response here, but I want to build on what Matt said about Nancy's deep inquiry. So I had she was an advisor on my dissertation, and I was so excited that there was an eruption of a natural stressor in front of me, and I emailed her and said, I'm going to change samples and study this. And I was couldn't be more excited at the opportunity to study stress as it unfolded. And I got an email back saying 2 words, let's discuss. And it did lead to a long meeting and a breakdown and a difference in how I always will view acute and chronic stress. I was seeing acute stress. We were studying allostatic load. But, fast forward to 30 years of a relationship, and I, by temperament, want quick answers. So I would go to Nancy and say, I would catch her in the coffee room and ask a question, or I would email her, I want an answer. And so if it was a good question, the answer would always be, back by email, the 2 words, let's discuss. And so I had some, oh, she's gonna say no, or, oh, we, and now need to wait for a meeting. So it's this kind of immediate reaction. But of course I learned that was such a gift and an invitation. And what Nancy did in the office, many of us, have seen her in meetings and how she does deep listening and how she integrates before she speaks. So in a meeting, in a let's discuss meeting with Nancy, she often listens and asks questions. So she comes in with her own biases, but she has no impulsivity or reactivity. She's overcome these natural biases to actually do deep inquiry. And so what so I tried to pass that on in mentoring with Let's Discuss. And there's a quote I would like to, that I've come to understand that she was living. And this is by Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, the poet. Be patient towards all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Live the question. And in the work we do, which is so passion and justice driven and slowly unfolding, we don't get quick answers. We live the question. And then the answer emerges over time. We might not even realize that because we're on to another question. And it just brings me back to that ability of Nancy's to understand that this work is about compassion, relationships, mentoring, and unfolding over time. And that patience, that wisdom that she always demonstrated with Let's Discuss is, something I think I try to embody and pay forward. But it's hard in this fast moving email culture. She did have an open door and we were all in person. It was a wonderful era.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. And I actually think this is an amazing segue to something that we're really excited about in the Center for Health and Community, the Nancy Adler Seed Grant Award Program. So for the future of this field. And so I'd like to welcome up Dr. Julia Adler-Milstein to present those. She's a professor of medicine and chief of the Division of Clinical Informatics and Digital Transformation in the School of Medicine. And as you might guess, the daughter of Nancy Adler, one of the daughters. All right.
Well, I now know today that strategy is not passed down genetically because it was not a good strategic move to agree to go after that panel. That was amazing. This whole day has really been amazing. And just on behalf of the family, thank you all for all the thought that went into this and everyone who's here today. She just would have loved this. Okay, now on to my job. In the spirit of revolution, start small. I really am honored to be part of the team that got to review the applications for the seed grant. It was really a joy to review them, and I don't think joy and reviewing will be two words I use in a sentence together often in my career, but these were really spectacular proposals. I will start by saying that Dr. Adler, feels a little weird to call her that, but that's what's written on my paper, was a champion for the social sciences over her 45-year career at UCSF. During her career, she served as the Lisa and John Pritzker Professor and Vice Chair of Psychology in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and Pediatrics, and as we know, was the Director of the Center for Health and Community. Much of her research explored how social and behavioral determinants get under the skin to shape health and health equity. She believes strongly in the importance of transdisciplinary collaboration for scientific advancement, and frequently assembled scholars from different disciplines to ponder complex problems. So in that spirit, to strengthen research spanning medicine, public health, and the social sciences at UCSF, the Nancy Adler Seed Grants program will support projects focused on social and behavioral determinants of health. And I will just add that we are continuing to raise funds for this important seed grants. And so if you have the interest and capacity to support that, that is an opportunity that is ongoing. So I'm thrilled to honor today the three inaugural recipients of the Seed Grant Award. The first is from two assistant professors in the Department of Radiology, Elizabeth George and Andreas Roschiger. Their project is assessment of differential effects of social determinants of health on early brain development using fetal MRI. And I'd like to call up their mentor, Orit Glenn, who's a professor and director of pediatric neuroradiology in the Department of Radiology, to accept the award today. There's an official.
Yeah, I want to thank on behalf of Elizabeth George and Andreas Roschiger, who unfortunately are both at a conference this week. So I'm happy to accept on their behalf. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And the second Seed Grant Award goes to Jessica Hua, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Her project is Social and Behavioral Determinants of Health and Associations with Premature Brain Maturation and Psychosis Conversion in Individuals at High Risk for Psychosis.
I'll just keep this really brief, but I just want to say thank you so much to everyone. I missed out on the pleasure of meeting and working with Nancy Adler, but I'm just so excited to continue on with her groundbreaking legacy. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least is Rachel Tomlinson, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And her project is investigating the potential of a 2-generational treatment modality to address 2-generational effects of socioeconomic stress on executive functioning. Congratulations.
I didn't know that I was going to be saying words, so this is terrifying. But I'm so grateful to be in such a cool place, doing such cool things, especially to my mentor, Alicia Lieberman, and the CTRP research team who has believed in me for several years. And I really appreciate it. And I look forward to our ongoing work. Thank you.
Pass it back to Eric to close us out.
All right, well, so that concludes this year's lectureship, except for the delicious lunch that is awaiting all of you on the terrace. So please join us on the 4th floor and we'll see you there. So thank you so much for joining.